Hello everyone, welcome back to a new video. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make a fantastical paper art piece depicting a scene of a knight and a castle. So let's just get right into it. I had this tragic scene pop into my mind a few weeks ago of a knight standing on a slope with everything burnt down and his kingdom in the background. So I made a really thorough sketch and I will use this as a base to work off of with this project. This piece also ends up having a lot of layers, almost 20, so it's definitely going to look cool and be worth the wait, so stay tuned till the end to see the finished product. So without further ado, let's get started. I got 20 sheets of 8.5 by 11 cardstock and I drew a 1/2 inch border around all of them. This border will be very important later on. I decided to work on the foreground slope first, and despite it being 20 layers deep, it's actually surprisingly simple because a lot of these hill layers in the foreground don't have a lot of detail on them, they're just rocky lines, and since my sketch is really detailed, I can trace it over onto my actual layers so I don't really have to do much work. So I just trace all of these rocky hill layers across onto separate sheets of paper. I usually don't end up doing this thorough of a sketch beforehand, but I think I'm going to start because this really makes it so much easier to actually make the piece, because I don't have to do any kind of guesswork. I know what everything is going to look like, so it just makes it a lot easier. And here I'm just showing you quickly how I trace. This is how I do all of my layers. Once I have the basic rocky shapes drawn out, I go in and add those few little tree stumps and broken branches and little grasses here and there to add those little details. And also, if you look at my sketch, it's a little bit hard to tell, but I do have a path coming from the foreground past the knight down the hill and up to the castle. So I add that in, starting on the 4th layer all the way back. I don't cut it out, I just draw it in for now. I was really excited about this project. I think it's going to look really good. I think it's going to look nice with all of the depth, and I really like how the castle and the hills and the moon and everything looks. It was super fun to create the little path winding through the hills. Now that I have all of my layers traced and drawn out, I go and I cut each layer out. This was pretty simple and honestly a little bit tedious, so while I'm doing this, I'm going to share a story that my lovely sister came up with for this Papercut art piece. The wind was mixed with the apprehensive smell of smoke when it blew. That terrible smell sent an ice-cold chill down the knight's spine as he stumbled towards the edge of the steep rocky hill and started to climb down the slope. Fearing that the worst had already happened, he quickened his pace, stumbling and sliding on rocks. More than once he had to fix his foothold to prevent his heavy armor from pulling him down. When he had traversed close enough to the edge to see the land that lay past the bottom of the hill, the knight's heart sank, for the worst scene of destruction he had ever seen lay before him. Even with the limited light that the moon provided, he could see the kingdom that lay below had been completely demolished. The smoke that rose from the fires that the battle had caused turned the air extremely thick and stuffy, making it hard to breathe. With no concern for his own safety, the knight charged down the hill. The once beautiful land that was his home had been completely reduced to a barren land of charred trees and singed grass. The silhouette of the castle he once called home stood out against the moon, dark and sinister. Smoke rose from the windows, darkening the sky, and he could see flames glowing in the distance. The winding road leading to the castle was strewn with broken trees and dead bodies. There was no sign of life anywhere. As the knight traveled further into the valley, he stepped into a world of horror. Amongst the trunks of the black trees, the cold, stiff bodies of recently departed souls lay with arms stretched out in awkward positions, ghastly, tortured expressions frozen on their faces. Some had their flesh completely seared off, while the features of others hid behind a thick mask of blood. As he laid his eyes on all of that death and destruction, a terrible feeling, a guilt, started to gnaw at the knight's heart. He had been this kingdom's proud protector for many long years, vanquishing one threat after another in the name of peace and justice. If only he had not been away on important business, he might have been able to stop these terrible scenes of slaughter from occurring. Of course, he had hurried home as soon as he heard the news, but it still pained him terribly that he did not arrive in time. It was hard work, but the knight managed to will himself forward. He had to know if she was still alive. The castle loomed overhead, marking his destination. When the knight arrived at the entrance of the castle, he stared at tall wooden doors, preparing himself for what he might find. The sides of the brick were scorched from the flames, and there were arrows sticking out from the wood door. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The creak of the thick wooden door was the only sound that could be heard in the empty, silent corridors, and the air was thick with the smell of blood and death. The space had a ghostly, haunted quality to it as the knight climbed the spiraling staircase that snaked towards the tower bedrooms of his love. His footsteps echoed down the empty corridor as he looked at the remnants of his once familiar home. Burned paintings, ripped drapes and clothes, broken down doors, everyone's possessions strewn about left and right, broken and trampled on. He feared the worst, but he kept going. When he arrived at the top of the stairs, he had to step over 2 more unfortunate bodies clad in armor. Taking the dead guards as a bad omen, the knight's heart quickened in his chest, and the pounding fear was only made worse when he turned to see that the door of her chambers had been broken down. The knight rushed to the opening left by the door so he could peek inside. Laying on the bed, behind drapes that had been hastily turned aside, lay his worst nightmare. Even in death, she was breathtakingly beautiful, like a sleeping angel. Her blonde hair flowed over the pillow like a golden shower of light, and her white nightgown was soaked with blood. Her lips were pale and her eyes were sunken. The only indication of the fact that she was not really asleep was a long gruesome gash around her throat which she wore like a bloody necklace. Torn by grief, the knight rushed to her side. He held her cold cheeks in his hands as he stared into her unseeing eyes, and all at once, his heart as well as his resolve shattered completely. He stared into her eyes and tears ran down his cheeks. Realizing that he could not live without her, he pulled his dagger from a sheath on his belt. Drawn to insanity by grief, he plunged the weapon into his heart. He turned his head to the light and looked out at the moon one last time as the blood started to flow. His vision started to get blurry, but he lurched forward and fell on his love, holding her in a last embrace, his lips brushing against hers as they turned cold. And there they stayed until the night was over, until the rain a few days later washed away the soot and put out the fires. They stayed through raging winter storms and hot summer days for eternity. Many months later, as the fury of a sudden snowstorm raged against the window panes of the tower, a tired young orphan girl stood in front of the bed where the bodies of the knight and his love lay under a pile of cobwebs. She had ventured into the abandoned castle in hopes of finding shelter from the storm. She was struck by the devoted couple that was laying before her. Turning to tear the dusty, threadbare drapes from the bed, she tenderly draped it over the couple to give them some sense of pride before walking quietly out of the room. And that was the story. I hope you guys enjoyed. I think it was a really beautiful story and it fits this Lightbox very, very well. Now back to the project. I wanted the knight to have a little bit more detail than the rest of the piece, so I cut him out and I cut his cape out twice out of cardstock and glued it on top of each other so it'll be thicker and it'll be darker. Then I used sketching paper, which is some really thin drawing paper, it's for sketching, and I cut out some shapes to create shading on the back of the knight's legs and arms and head. And then I cut lines into the whole knight to lighten him up. I really like doing this because it adds a little bit of shading and it makes it look a little bit more dynamic. Here he is against the light. I think he looks good. Now it is time for all of the smoke. I didn't want the smoke to accidentally look like the clouds, and I wanted them to just look a little bit different and stand out, so I got a sheet of sketching paper which is thinner than cardstock so it'll let more light through and look a little different. I cut all of my smoke clouds out of this. Again, I traced them from that original drawing, and it's pretty simple. I cut them out one by one and then glue them into place on their designated layers. And now it's almost the last step, which is cutting details into the layers. I don't want to add too much, but I wanted a little bit. So on all the tree trunks and pieces, I cut some little lines to look like tree bark. And in the smoke, I cut a few little swirly shapes here and there, again, just to break it up a bit. I went through and did this for every single layer. Once I started getting into the distance, it was a little bit different. For these hills that have the little path winding up, I cut out the path and I used some tape to hold the pieces together. Clear tape is really useful if you accidentally make a mistake or just some pieces don't hold together that you want to hold together. When I get to the castle, I cut out teeny tiny little windows and I cut lines basically wherever I drew lines. That's kind of the way I go about these things, and it works pretty well. And the last step before I can assemble this light box is cutting out the little path. I cut out all of those little shapes that I drew in that represent the path, and I covered the holes with sketching paper again. And it's actually not the last step because I forgot that I have to make the sky and the moon. So I got a piece of sketching paper to cover the sky and I cut a crescent moon shape out of it. And I used this bottle cap of something, I forgot what, to trace a circular shape. Then I cut a smaller circle to shade the side of the moon that's not lit up because I wanted a crescent moon, not a full moon. I covered the hole with tracing paper, which is way lighter. It's for tracing drawings, so of course it's almost see-through, but I used this to cover holes and things and it just looks really nice. I glue everything together and that's basically it for the moon. I did, however, want a few stars in the sky, so I got 2 different size sewing needles, one bigger one thinner one, and I just poked random holes around the sky to look like stars, and I think it adds a magical touch. And now for a very exciting part of this project. I had a vision for this piece. I knew exactly what colors I wanted. I wanted the sky to look blue, I wanted the fires to look orange, and I wanted there to be some purple. However, it's hard to do that with just LED strips because they're one color or they overpower each other and it becomes really difficult. But I did this technique before where I just use a white light and I covered the back with colored paper, and then the white light shines through the colored paper, and whatever color the paper is, that's the color it lights up. So I wanted to try to use some blue paper for the sky, cut out holes for purple, orange, yellow, and then when I put this in the back and light it up, all those colors will shine through. And now it's finally time to assemble. 20 layers with 1/2 inch thick foam board is 10 inches. This was a really deep Papercut art piece. I usually don't make them this deep. I usually do 8 to 10 layers. This was 20, so it was quite a doozy. But I really like these bigger, deeper light boxes and I think they look a lot better. It was a lot of foam board though. But basically you cut 1/2 inch strips of foam board and you glue it on that border you made and stack them, gluing them together as you go. Here it is all put together. I put that paper on the back and I set up a white light, and here is the finished product. I love it so much. I am so happy with how this project turned out. I love the colors, I love the depth, I love the concept, I love how it turned out. I love everything about this and I think it looks really great, and I think it's one of my favorite projects I've ever made. If you enjoyed it as well, please consider subscribing, and I will see you next time. Bye!